wanted to pick up on that, Ray. You're saying probably in about another 20 years we'll have the capacity to reverse engineer the brain, if you like, so we'll understand how it works, and then that leads to what you describe as the singularity, where we combine. But a more prosaic question from my perspective is, if we kind of tend to think linearly as humans, one thing follows another, another, how can we start to, and I'll, Dan, perhaps bring you in, how can we start to figure out ways to shift our thinking so we're not constantly surprised by that massive change that we deal with?
Well, it's a good point. Linear thinking is hardwired in our brains. I mean, that's why we have a brain. So that when we walked through the field 1,000 years ago, and we said, oh, that animal's going this way, I'm going this way, we're going to meet up there, I'm going to go this other way. It was good for survival. And so we could predict the future and make decisions that were intelligent. But those built-in predictors are linear, and it works great for predicting where an animal will be in 20 seconds. It happens to not work well for the progression of information technology, because the technology builds on itself. We use the latest technology to create the next, and I have a mathematical treatment of that, of why that is an exponential, but the empirical data is very strong. I mean, in the case of computers, it goes back to the 1890 census. It's been very smooth exponential growth, uninterrupted by anything like wars or recessions. And it's not our intuition. So I would say the major difference between my critics and myself is they're using their intuition and saying, well, you know, things are going to progress linearly. For example, halfway through the Genome Project, 7 years into this 15-year project, we finished 1% of the project. And the critics were saying, told you this wasn't going to work. You know, what, 7 years, 1%? It's going to take 700 years, like we said. My response was, no, it's almost done. I mean, by the time you get 1%, you've got some traction. That's only 7 doublings from 100%. And it's been doubling every year. And what happened was it continued to double every year and was finished 7 years later. But we don't think exponentially, because that's not our intuition, and that's hardwired. But I think as people see and experience what is really now very apparent, and not just in laboratories that a few scientists can see, but the general public sees they can buy an iPhone that's twice as good for half the price of 2 years ago. They're getting used to this exponential progression. It's becoming more innate in our thinking.
So, Dan, how do we not trip ourselves up constantly with this? How can we perhaps think differently about it?
Well, I think we've got to think about this growth that Ray's described, and there's other aspects to it too. We've got to start thinking about it much more biologically. What we have to realize is that the whole big system is much more like a biome, a biosphere, than we thought in the past. And what that means is that, just as in the biosphere, it is extremely likely to have what are known in evolutionary biology as arms races. And in this case, some of them are very troubling. Herb Lynn and his group did a study for the National Academy of Sciences looking at cyber warfare. And one of the points they made, which is a very chilling point, is that unlike any earlier arms race, literal arms race in the history of technology, this one, hugely, by orders of magnitude, it's one of those big numbers like Ray loves to use, favors the attacker. Think about nuclear weapons for a moment. You can't make a nuclear bomb in your bedroom. It's very expensive, and it's still very expensive to refine the uranium to make the fissionable material. But you can make a bit of truly destructive software in your bedroom. And you can try it 100 times a day. There's no penalty for failure. And the cost, the defense against this is what, 10,000, 100,000, a million, a billion times more expensive than the offense. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have to live in a world where the immune system of this wonderful network balloons at an exponential rate simply to protect itself against these super cheap, super fast, super transparent things that kids can build in their bedroom.
Well, we actually have experience with this. Software viruses are put out every day. So not everybody is writing software viruses and then just filing them in their diary. Lots of people put them out. And we do have a technological immune system that detects new viruses, works with humans to reverse engineer them and create an antiviral program and spreading that out virally. And what has the track record been? It's actually been pretty good. Nobody's taken down even a small portion of the internet for 1 second over the last 10 years. It's been very robust. And so it's not something that we can just cross off our concern list because it's obsolete the moment it's finished. But this technological immune system, which does exist, has been working pretty well. Now, it's not guaranteed to work tomorrow, and it is a concern. I mean, it is part of the promise versus peril, but it's not the case that we're just sitting there defenseless and we have this sort of virgin internet that can be attacked. And there's actually a lot of sophisticated defense, and we have an immune system, and it is tested on a daily basis, and it has held up quite well.
So far, so good.
Exactly.
Tenley.
So in terms of the challenges as an innovator, I think, innovation is what gets you there in the first place. Once you get to that point where you've got an established market, I think where we kind of fail or where we become complacent is when we start to operate and manage and stop and less focused on innovation. And so, one of the big questions for myself as the founder, as an entrepreneur, is to really continually innovate. And one way that I try to do that is to look out at adjacent fields of technology, because generally, once you're an expert in your field, you're going to miss the innovations that happen around you. And those are the people that become disruptive in your space. So, if you're a surgeon, more than often than not, you're going to focus on honing your skills to make sure you don't hurt the patient. But the innovation will happen somewhere in a lab somewhere, for example, a bacterial infection which actually creates an ulcer. So you can solve it by antibiotics instead of having to go under the knife. So that is going to be completely disruptive to your world, but you never saw it coming. So as an innovator, as a manager of a business, how do you tackle these questions of change and unpredictability of change? I think the key is to try and look at adjacent fields of technology, because all too often we focus on silos, on vertical segments of markets we know, and we fail to recognize emerging markets that may be on the peripheral, and often asking our customers about what their needs are doesn't generally give us the answers we're looking for, because they're not who the new market players are going to be. And so I think that's really the key, is to try and look at how other innovations in other areas are going to impact
that
your
links
space.
in very much with what Dan was saying about thinking in terms of ecosystems. Because Narelle and I were talking about how many people in this audience, for example, would still view what they do within industry terms,
Right.
whereas if they look at business ecosystems and the dynamic relationships they have and the extraordinary richness of that, you see different things. Can I just pose one very quick question to you, because you're very much a practical innovator. And in the US, for example, I'm thinking of the systems that are not working for us well today. Right. I mean, some of the things Ray is talking about seem to me to be working extremely well for us and for human benefit. But there are some that are not, some which I really worry about, like the patent system. Now, in the US, for example, there's an enormous amount of patent trolling, huge buying up of old patents, really to litigate, to actually protect and litigate and not evolve. And I'm aware that, for example, if you just take one example, there are over 3,000, I don't know the exact number, but factually there are over 3,000 patents, individual patents, for what you and I would refer to as toast. The bread, you put in a thing, you turn it down, it pops up, and it's toast. How do you deal, I mean, open source, peer-to-peer, that's different, because you're really saying, I'm not going to play that game, I'm playing a different game.
Right. So it's a challenging question. The way that I approach patenting and intellectual property protection is to think about the question in terms of what is easily enforceable. So how are you actually going to enforce your patents? So some things are best left to trade secrets. So the trade-off with patenting something is you disclose to the state how you actually do something in return for a 30, 20-year monopoly in that domain. But the reality is, unless you have very deep pockets, it's very difficult to protect that. However, so in that case, some things are much easier left in the trade secrets domain, where you have the residual knowledge, but there are things that are very easily enforceable. And so, for example, I use, one example is the UI that we use in our software, which makes it very easy for a non-specialist to actually see whether where an EEG signal, an electroencephalography, is actually clean, easy to, and good enough for the system to acquire a clean signal from the brain. And that's something that is very easily enforceable, because the moment someone else has a similar UI, we can say, hey, you're infringing on our patent. But some of the more complex algorithms, those maybe we could consider them left to a trade secret, because disclosing them doesn't really necessarily allow you to enforce them as effectively, because it's trying to show that someone's using a similar process is much harder, similar methodology is much harder.
And can you pot them so that they're truly trade secrets?
It's certainly not an easy one, but one of the things that I think, as a small company, you need to pick your battles, and you don't want to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars creating an IP portfolio that ends up not really protecting you at the end of the day. And so I think one of the things that you do is you try and find a nice balance. Obviously, people lies at the core of that, right? If you've got trade secrets, you make sure that they are well compensated and they're part of your core team, so they don't take that residual knowledge and go elsewhere.
Well, there is a public policy issue supporting your concern. The patent system, which hasn't changed much, I mean, there's been a little tinkering with it, but it was devised in the 19th century to give an inventor a little bit of a head start in his or her invention. So it gave you it was originally 17 years from when you got the patent. Now it's 20 years from when you file it. So 20 years advantage. That was, a portion of a generation of technology. So if a technology generation was 50, 60 years, you got kind of a head start. Today, 20 years is not a third of a generation. It's maybe 5 or 6 generations or more of technology. How many times does technology turn over in 20 years? It's a lifetime compared to when we started. The pace of change has accelerated enormously from 150 years ago, but the 20 years is still the same. So the consequence of the patent is dramatically changed. And so this is an area where the law has not kept up with the reality. Yeah. And it can stifle innovation. You might wonder how can these companies like Microsoft and Google and Apple put out these products that have thousands of features, each of which infringes dozens of patents. It's because they have very large portfolios as a defensive measure. So if you sue me on these, I'm going to sue you, and I've got these 4,000 patents. And that's why Google recently acquired this big patent portfolio, so they could fight back with Android. But it is a public policy issue. We don't re-examine these laws in light of how dramatically technology has changed in 150 years.
It's my job to ensure we stay on time tonight, and it's time now to take a break. There's a couple of issues there around control and how we adapt in terms of the organisational structures, which would be great to get into after the break. We'll take a short break now for some supper, and we'll come back and draw you into the conversation. So thank you very much for your attention today. Thanks to our guest, and we'll see you about 5 to 8. Thanks.